sit back, enjoy, and hear the story of David, King of the Golden Age.
Thank you, Tom. Well, good afternoon. And apologies for missing last time. I left you in suspense as David had just become king of the whole of the tribes of Israel. Well, he became king not only of the two southern tribes, but also by request of the other tribes as well. We don't know the terms of the covenant. They made a covenant with him, but we don't know the terms of it. I'll hazard a guess. Was it a promise by David to overthrow the Philistines' authority that was so oppressive over them? Well, the Philistines were not worried. They still thought of David as one of their tame vassals. And then there was no enemy lurking from elsewhere. All was quiet too on the international front, so no worries. Possibly, David also promised the other tribes to make them a great nation in control of the whole land, just as Yahweh had promised them long ago. What is in no doubt is that David did not waste time. He took quick advantage of the golden opportunities to assert himself, not against the Philistines yet, but with his eye on a more immediate target, Jerusalem. Jerusalem, originally called Salem, belonged to the Canaanite Hittite tribe of Jebusites. It was a hilltop fort, an impregnable city of Salem. Salem meaning safety, because nobody could get there. And therefore the forerunner of the modern Jewish greeting, shalom, safety, peace to you. Do you remember that the King Melchizedek of Salem came out of his fortress to greet Abraham when he passed through? Yes, it's been going all that time. It's been there a long, long time. But Jerusalem had not been conquered by the Philistines or anyone else because it was situated on a high hilltop surrounded by 3 deep valleys. And I'm sure I can show you some pictures. We have David, the king of the Golden Age. There's one of the very steep valleys tumbling down the side of the rocks, with Salem, or the city of David as it became, right up the top on the left-hand side. Just see how rocky it was for any army to try and climb and get in. And there's another view of it. Almost impregnable. The 3 deep valleys made very limited access for any warring enemy whose soldiers could only approach by a narrow track from the north. And that narrow track could very easily be defended. Also, it was geographically out of the way of any international army marching along the coastal plain. And we have a map. Don't know how clearly you can see that, but can you see the Mediterranean Sea on the left-hand side, or the west side, and the River Jordan and the Dead Sea on the right-hand side? If you can find the Dead Sea, Jerusalem is just to the left of the top of that. So it's neither on the coastal strip, nor anywhere in particular, there's a roadway. It's just on its own. And while the people there caused no trouble, nobody troubled them. It really was a place of safety. David's capture of this impregnable city was simple and spectacular. So much so that the citizens, who later became his secretaries and scribes, were much too embarrassed to describe how he captured it in any sort of detail. But it is a story to rival Homer's tale of the wooden horse of Troy. No one died. No damage was done. David's army entered through the open gate. No buildings were damaged. No one lost their home or their job, or apart from the king. There's no mention that even he was killed. He was, however, the only person to lose out. He lost his crown, and he lost all the contents of his treasury, which David took for himself. But even the priests of Salem continued as before, offering sacrifices with all their accustomed rituals, except that now they would all be offered by command of David to the God Yahweh instead of their own gods. And everyone found that life went on as before. And maybe they were all going to profit from the new situation. That they certainly did. And as we'll find out later, but how did David achieve such an amazing prize? And another question for another time, how did the people of Jerusalem eventually get their revenge half a century later? The two accounts in the Old Testament of David's success are very sparse in what they tell us. There are just 5 verses in the second book of Samuel and 6 verses in the much, much later book of Chronicles. I'll read them to you, and you'll see how bizarre they sound. 1 Samuel is the older account and is almost contemporary with the event. And that was about 1000 BCE. Very easy date for us to remember. The account says, "The king and his men marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, 'You will not come in here. Even the blind and the lame will turn you back,' thinking David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, which is now the city of David. And David had said on that day, 'Whoever wishes to strike down the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind.' David occupied the stronghold and renamed it the City of David. David built the city all around from the Millo onwards." And that's all. But we have a clue, a water shaft. The later account reads, "Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, now called the City of David. David had said, 'Whoever attacks the Jebusites first shall be my chief and commander.' And Joab went up first, so he became the chief. And David resided in the stronghold." And that's all. At first reading, one might just gloss over this simple tale without becoming aware of its immense importance. But let's pause for a while. Until the year 1867, no one was any the wiser, until an English army commander, Charles Warren by name, arrived as an engineer for the newly found Palestine Exploration Fund. And while staying in Jerusalem, he began, out of interest, to make a survey of Jerusalem's water supply. In the course of 3 years, and all by candlelight, with pencil and paper, he explored the course of Hezekiah's tunnel. Now, have any of you been to Jerusalem? Have you been to Hezekiah's tunnel? So you know what it's like and how long it is and how big it is, how amazing it is. Let's have some pictures. There's Commander Charles Warren, Victorian as he was. And this is the beginning of the water supply. It starts in a spring outside in the Kidron Valley, a spring of water which supplied Jerusalem with all its water requirements. He explored that watercourse from the Gihon Spring in the Kidron Valley. There's the course of the water. There are people struggling through it because it's a popular tourist trail. And eventually it comes out at the pool of Siloam in the middle of modern-day Jerusalem. And then, almost by accident, he happened to look up while in the tunnel and saw in the gloom what looked like another shaft. He returned the next day with mountaineering equipment and explored it. Sorry. We've got a diagram first. They've got it in the wrong order. There's the diagram. At the bottom right, you can see the Siloam spring, a straight line taking the water parallel, which is what you've walked as Hezekiah's tunnel. And then along there, can you see there's a shaft going upwards? Now that's what Commander Warren found by looking up and returned the next day to explore it with mountaineering equipment. And that's what he went to explore. It was only 45 feet in length, but it enabled him to scramble to the lower area of the city. And he thought it could have been part of the original city of Zion, or Salem, or city of David, and therefore possibly the water shaft that Joab had found. It's still known as Warren's Shaft, and his discovery was confirmed in the 1960s by the English archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon. There she is. She tackled a very difficult dig nearby. She did a vertical trench right down inside the steep hillside. Very dangerous, but very demanding. But she found the remains of a thick wall dated much earlier than the time of David, so obviously the old Jebusite wall. And just above the Gihon spring, which would have provided the Jebusites with their water from the well. In place, they wouldn't need to go outside the city to get any water. She had found this at a turning point in the wall, the lowest point of the Jebusite city wall. And this is now considered one of the most spectacular finds in the history of archaeology in Jerusalem. So, back to that's the part of the old wall that she began to discover. Very tough, very thick, as you can see. So back to David. It seems that he threw down a challenge to his men to find a way into the city, a challenge won by Joab, who then became David's most loyal commander of his army. Joab found the well shaft from the Gihon spring in the Gihon Valley and somehow climbed up into the Jebusite city. Once there, he could open the gates from the inside, probably at night, so that David's soldiers could walk in unnoticed until it was all too late. As I said before, not unlike Homer's tale of the wooden horse of Troy. Now, David soon ingratiated himself with the city's citizens, not confiscating anything other than the crown and the contents of the treasury, but selling the idea that he'd obviously had in mind for a long time, that their city could become his capital city not only for the southern Israelite tribes of Judah and Benjamin, but also for all the other tribes as well. This he achieved, and Israel became a nation state with a highly sophisticated civil service administration team already in place. The citizens of Jerusalem approved. They were now dominant over much more territory than ever before, and it really was fait accompli. Everyone was pleased. Even the city's priests were happy. They had to serve a different God, but in their own way, of course, without any difference in their rituals. After all, David's God Yahweh had proved himself much stronger than their old gods, now described as purely useless. And David even inherited the prophet Nathan. He did, however, do some building very quickly. The Millo Tower is mentioned to protect the Gihon Spring against any future easy conquest. All was very positive and boded well for the future. But then the Philistines woke up. Their tame vassal had broken free and needed to be checked pretty quickly. There were 2 battles in quick succession, but David's army was so cock-a-hoop after capturing Jerusalem that the Philistines were soundly beaten on both occasions. And now the tables were turning. And as the Philistines were pushed back nearer to the sea, the Israelites even captured several of their idol gods, which were abandoned in their flight, as well as much more, of course, of their land. And it must have been about this time that the Israelites also captured the secret of smelting iron for themselves. So, other nations nearby, watch out. It wasn't very long before word got around in that part of the world, and visitors began to arrive. The first one was King Hiram of Tyre, one of the great trading Phoenician cities to the north, wanting to be friends with King David. He sent David a whole load of cedar trees. Cedar trees, look at them in their beauty. They grew prolifically in Lebanon, never in the hill country of Judah or Israel. It was quite unknown and beautiful, the best gift that could possibly have arrived. He didn't nearly send the trees, though. He also sent a force of workmen, masons and carpenters, to build David a grand palace. David was very gratified. His kudos was rising among the other neighboring kings. Indeed, now David had a sizable kingdom, free from the Philistine menace, and a capital city with all its infrastructure complete and undamaged. And we can see his true brilliance emerging with his very clear policies. First, whatever David took over, at first by conquest and later by invitation, it was done with minimal damage to the people or their property, so reducing the urge for rebellion or revenge. Secondly, there was, however, no negotiation. I will be your king, said David, and my God Yahweh will be your God. He appropriated the crown and the treasury for himself, but nothing more. And as David grew richer and more areas here, and the more people who came to join his kingdom, either by conquest or say, please, can we be part of your kingdom? That's how it happened. As he grew richer, taking over the crowns and the treasures of each group that came into his orbit, he refrained from taxing people. So they were very happy, and they grew richer as well. Unity was imposed religiously. As always, and as it still is today, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, it was their form of religion that was suddenly imposed on all the citizens of the country. I will be your king, and my God will be your God, was the precept. But the priests continued to function as always, sacrificing with their own rituals, their own ceremonies, their music and their songs, but all offered now to Yahweh instead of the gods of Salem. Back in Jerusalem, now called the City of David, everyone was adjusting to their new master. No mention was made of the old Jebusite king. Was he killed? Well, we have no reason to think so. It may even be that he was the Araunah, the man who came to give David his threshing floor nearby. And we go to a map here, two maps. With the left-hand map, at the bottom you can see the old city of Salem on its promontory with 3 steep valleys each side of it, now called the City of David. The Gihon Spring is just outside to the right, and at the end of that promontory there is a slight dip before you go up again to what is encircled there, the top of Mount Moriah. Now that had a flat area, and that was the threshing floor that was offered to David. So outside the City of David, down the dip and up again, and the threshing floor, of course, is the place where the temple was eventually built. So we go to Jerusalem now, and it all looks as if it's just along the same road. But, pardon me, in the olden days, you had to go out of the City of David, down the dip, and then up again to Mount Moriah. And the map on the right, again, shows you the City of David at the bottom, with the 3 steep valleys, and this Mount Moriah and its threshing floor to the north. Well, David accepted the gift of the threshing floor, except that he didn't accept it as a gift. He insisted on paying for it. Any new temple would not be a gift, it would be his temple. For the old Jebusite aristocracy enthusiastically embraced the new system, as it brought greater kudos for them and their city. Likewise, its capture and the takeover of its infrastructure transformed the Israelite peoples into a nation-state with a ready-made, grand and imposing capital city. And of course, the sophisticated aristocrats of Jerusalem naturally became the new sophisticated aristocrats of Israel. The army remained in the sole charge of Joab, and they continued to conquer more and more territories for David, even as far as the city of Damascus, with all its gold and rich silks. While back in Jerusalem, the royal guardsmen, the Cherethites and the Pelethites, merely transferred their loyalty to David, who paid them well and kept their commander Benaiah in his job. There is no hint of dissatisfaction. But do remember, please, this is the official record. The same held good for the civil service. Sariah was a ready-made secretary. Jehoshaphat, the chancellor, was in charge of the trading accounts, and Nathan the prophet became David's chief advisor. And do please note their new names. No more Baals in the name now, but names beginning with J-E-R, Yah, or ending in I-A-H, Yah, became the norm. So Syria, etc. The civil servants could write and continue to write. Let's have a look at their writing. Looks pretty weird, doesn't it? But it is very ancient. They wrote in their own language, of course, not the language of the Israelites, but the language of the Jebusite Hittite community. Well, that is the language of aristocratic Jerusalem. And that became the new language for Israel. Because they wrote in that language and ruled in that language, the Israelites conformed and took on that language as well. And that is the beginning of the phonetic alphabet known to us as the language of Hebrew. It came from Ugarit, that's Hittite trading center right up in the north. And remember the Ra Shamra tablets I told you about some months ago now? Found in 1932. Primitive Hebrew writing. And is it any wonder that these people glossed over the embarrassingly easy capture of their beloved city by David in their records? And religiously. Yes, the people of Jerusalem were wowed by the power of David's God, Yahweh, who was now, by law, going to tolerate no rivals. So this is a takeover. They gave him a new title, the God of Hosts. That is, the God who is greater than any other, thus replacing the old god El. There's no hint yet, you see, that Yahweh is the only God ever. He is the only God for Israel, and a powerful God too, and replaces the other gods who are relegated to obscurity. It's another 500 years before we get to the idea that there is only one God. So we've got a long way to go yet. And my next statement is made rather with my tongue in my cheek while I talk about the priests of Jerusalem. Their priests, like many others even today, were more concerned with the correct rituals of their worship than anything else. So they adopted all their priestly activities and sacrificial worship to Yahweh, no problem. And their chief god priest Zadok remained chief priest, now chief priest of Yahweh in Jerusalem. The New Year Canaanite festival kept its importance in Jerusalem, even though it was dangerously like mixing chalk and cheese. Do you remember some weeks ago I told you that the Canaanite ideas and the Yahweh ideas just could not mix? Chalk and cheese. Pardon me. Well, they kept the Canaanite festival, so David became a priest king in the festival. It was transformed, and even their songs to Baal were altered in order to keep them. Pardon me. For example, Yahweh is king. Yahweh says to my Lord David, "Sit at my right hand." And Yahweh has sworn, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And many more. A drink of water. We still sing them, the enthronement psalms of Jerusalem in our book of Psalms. And we sing about Yahweh's enthroned above the cherubim, the lesser gods, of course, and let the earth quake. Holy is he, the mighty King, lover of justice. Now please note the word holy. It comes from Jerusalem and was from now on attributed to Yahweh. Later, I do apologise. The word holy was later expounded by the great prophet of Jerusalem, Isaiah, and his song, Holy, 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 is Yahweh God of hosts, we sing Sunday by Sunday. Not three holies, of course, but the holiest. It's their way of doing the comparative, right up to the most. So the third one is the most holy. And the word holy means separate or different. In all this excitement, let's find another picture. David decided that Jerusalem should become the new home for the Ark of the Covenant, which had been almost forgotten. It had been left in the care of Abinadab ever since it had been returned to the Israelites by the Philistines. It suggests to us that life had continued much as usual to the tribespeople, regardless of Jerusalem, while David was consolidating his takeover of the crown. But now a significant change was to happen. The Israelite tribespeople would now relate to their God Yahweh in Jerusalem. The ark was placed on a new cart for the journey. David led the procession with dancing, songs, lyres, harps, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals. Quite a procession. David, as priest king, was wearing a linen ephod. Remember, a linen tunic with a priestly breastplate. But he danced so exuberantly that it all swelled up highly around him, so highly that his wife Michal, who was watching from a window, was very embarrassed. And so, we are told, despised him in her heart. The ark was successfully installed in the tent of meeting, somewhere, maybe even in the house of the old gods of Jerusalem. We don't really know. The day ended with a great sacrifice to Yahweh, a blessing by David, the priest king, and a banquet for all the people. When David arrived home, however, he was met by a very angry wife, Michal. And the story ends, and Michal had no child to the day of her death. Another, Abiathar, the priest of Yahweh, came to Jerusalem as well, and was installed on equal terms alongside Zadok. It's anyone's guess how equal Abiathar felt in comparison with Zadok. More like a country bumpkin coming to town, I would think. Now, David became conscious that he was living in a luxurious house of cedar, while Yahweh was still housed in a tent. So he called for his prophet advisor Nathan, who initially agreed to his plans, but next day returned with a different idea. This time, for a different sort of house of David, an ancestral house. He said, "Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before Yahweh, and your throne shall be established forever. David was very flattered, and his house, his family, became his dynasty. And this agreement is now known as the Davidic Covenant, or the Covenant of Jerusalem theology, which always looked to a son of David to be its king. And in later Roman times, of course, began to be messianic in its hope for a future son of David, a title then associated to Jesus by the gospel writers. It was, however, an unconditional covenant, very different from the Mosaic ones. The Mosaic covenant, which was more familiar to the Israelites. You see the trouble that's festering for the future. We have the tribespeople in the majority with their old customs, but the sophisticated capture of Jerusalem has put that above them, with all the tensions that you can imagine to come later on. The result of Nathan's advice was a brand new prestigious temple was not built in David's time. The later book of Chronicles couldn't alter history, but did insist that it was David who bought and prepared all the building materials before he died. While all this was going on, Joab was adding more and more lands to David's kingdom. David became king over all the other tribes of Canaan, from north to south, from east to west. Joab even took charge of Damascus when the king had been killed far away near the river Euphrates. And he brought back many gold shields and pieces of bronze armor, as well as horses and chariots. Further north, the king of Hamath sent his son Joram with voluntary gifts of gold and bronze. Any of you been to Hamath in Syria? The place where the huge water wheels used to be the feature until, of course, the recent Syrian war, which is a shame. The Philistines made one more attempt to fight David's forces, but failed. And gradually they slipped into obscurity and melted away to their little hold on the coast, which we now know as the Gaza Strip. So, in 33 years, a huge transformation had occurred. From the newly accepted David as king over all the various Israelite tribes, to the rich and influential ruler of a sizable kingdom, which was held in respect by all its neighbours. What a difference! David, indeed, the king of the golden age. But this, of course, is the official version. What about the real man? The real man, David, behind the facade? Well, next week, in 2 weeks' time, we'll find out. You'll find out more from a journalist, a mole living inside the palace, who wrote down for us what was going on inside the walls. And that is a very fascinating document to read. We call it the Court Chronicle. And he wrote the story of what was going on and the story we shall have next time. So thank you for listening. Thank you for putting up with my cough. I do apologise, but I hope it didn't spoil your enjoyment too much. Thank you for coming. There are 2 papers on the table for today's talk, which you can pick up as you go home.
Thank you, Barbara. You definitely deserve that round of applause for keeping going through the coughing fit. Well done. And I'm sure, once again, we've all been absolutely fascinated by your insights into that time of David. Yeah, I feel I want to go and find that stream.
Always surprises me how modern people were then compared with people now. Yeah. I've long since dismiss the idea that people long ago were primitive people.
No.
They were as sophisticated and as clever as we are.
Yes, they just hadn't discovered some of the
They hadn't got the technology or the things that
yeah,
we take for granted.
but they were just like us.
They were.
They were just
Very
just as intelligent
ingenious.
and conniving and devious and
Yeah.
joyful and all of those.
Scheming.
Scheming, yes. That's it.
And what is amazing, and I'm always staggered by this, all these stories of imperfect people, disastrous times, revenge, intrigues, etc. God's will comes through the whole way.
Yeah.
By fair means or foul, I feel sometimes.
It certainly does.
But he has a great habit of getting his own way in the end.
Yes.
And I think that's the confidence with which I'm a Christian today.
Yes, no, I like that. I like that very much. I couldn't help draw a parallel when you were talking about how David would deliberately not destroy places that he conquered. And I was finding myself comparing that to Putin's attitude to the Ukraine right now. Where he's,
yes.
There
Won't many
clearly-
people in Ukraine be friendly to Russia anymore?
Absolutely. He's not out to make friends in the Ukraine, is he? Unlike David, there was a wisdom there for Putin, which for David, which Putin is not showing, isn't there?
He was a clever bloke.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Brilliant. Well, thank you again. Thank you for struggling
right.
through. Thank you for a fascinating talk. Shall we show our appreciation one more time?